this portrait we're doing today, we're actually going to get it on the wall by using the method of the Doodle grid. And for those of you that don't know what Doodle grid is, it's basically an assembly of patterns and shapes on the wall that help me line up the portrait later on so I can get everything perfectly in place and all the perspective is correct. I will show you a little bit later on the photo part, but for now what you want to do is get the most contrasting colour to your background, so it's white and obviously that's going to be black. And I'm going to just put small shapes, so squares, love hearts, triangles on the wall, on the area I want to pick the portrait. Take your time layering the grid down and make sure it is a strong contrasting colour. When I first learned this method when I was in Amsterdam, I remember using a mid pink on a light background, which was a complete disaster, and I had to end up going over the entire grid, again costing me half an hour. So that's something which may seem obvious but you want to avoid. And once you've done your Doodle grid, you'll end up with something that looks just like this. There's no specific pattern, it's just a random assortment of shapes, so do as many shapes as you want until you feel comfortable. I know a lot of artists that sometimes space out a bit further, and there's also other artists that like to keep the Doodle grid tight, so there's not so much more of the background showing. It's just whatever you feel comfortable with and the level of skill you're at. And if you feel confident enough to even just rub a portrait by yourself, you can do so, but for this tutorial, I want to really strip it all back and show you the basic ways to do things so even a beginner can go out on their own and do really good looking portraits. Now using your phone, you want to take a straight on picture, and as a key note here is to remember that all camera lenses have a natural curve to it, so avoid taking the picture too close up as the edges will be warped. Next you want to upload your photo reference and Doodle grid into the Photo Layers app and line it up accordingly. And if you need help with this stage, have a look at one of my previous portrait tutorials because I go in way more depth there, how you can use the app Photo Layers. Another really cool tip is when you're planning the portrait is to label your cans. Each can I've taken to this wall today has a label on it which is just used with duct tape and a pen saying things like skim 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which gives me the range from dark to light. Now it's time for us to start the sketching process. Using the Doodle grid, you want to line the portrait accordingly from phone to wall. You can pretty much use any colour at this stage to sketch, but I like to use a mid-tone so it's a lot more easier to see the lines later on down the road. I'm using a mid-skin tone for the sketching as the colour also exists in the portrait we'll be doing today. So if you are a super saver just like me, this technique is good for you. I also like to keep the workstation or area very clinical and tidy as I work along. So here I'm just lining up all the colours, like I said earlier, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a few of the other surrounding colours for the portrait, so it's a lot easier whilst I'm working to know exactly where I'm at. A common mistake that I see so many people do starting out is to focus too much on the details straight out the gate. This is the complete opposite of what you should be doing. We want to imagine the portrait comes in 3 stages. Stage 1 being the initial sketch, which we've already laid down in this video. Then we move on to stage 2, where we focus on big areas of colour, looking into the darkest and lightest areas first, not concentrating on the details too much. And stage 3 is when we finally focus on the smaller aspects that rarely make the portrait pop off the wall. So if you squint your eyes when looking at your reference, it then becomes easier for you to see where the lighter tones exist and where the darker tones exist. And for now, you are just blocking in those areas. And once again, don't worry too much about all the details, be quite loose, because further on down the road, we'll be working colours back into these light and dark blocks. And now we have both light and darks roughly in place, we can now start using the midtones to connect them together so it's almost acting like a bridge. Notice how nothing fancy is going on at this stage. We are literally only using 4 colours to map out the entire portrait. The reason for this is that by having a tight colour palette, we get to keep a congruent harmony through the whole art piece. This rule does not only apply for portrait work, but can be applied to your illustration work, even if you're into fashion and interior design. So really, when it comes to this kind of art, less is more. And for the lips, there's going to be no detail, but I'm just going to put it on the base, darkest tone, just cover the whole area so they're in place, ready for later on down the line to add the details when we move up to stage 3. And what you want to do when you hit about the 30% mark of progress with a portrait, and this also applies to if you do a lot of oil paintings or acrylic portraits, is to lay down the background. This way you can see the harmony it has with the portrait, because background colours will massively affect the tones you put in the face. When it comes to the eye, it's best to start with the white of the eye first. But if you have a keen eye for what we're doing in this portrait, you would notice that no white is actually going in place, but instead here we are using the colour grey. And there are two main reasons for this. Number one, using pure white is a pure way to make your portraits look hella cartoony. And two, by using greys at this stage, when it comes to finally putting those smaller details, you know the bit where it's that little white dot that just shines off the whole eye and puts it together, that will be more effective 100 times if it's there on its own instead of being mixed in with the other whites. And I'm actually taking the same colour we used for the background and just putting a small indication of the rounded bottom of the eye itself. Like I spoke about earlier about putting down the base shapes first, here on the eye we're zeroing in a little bit more. So just imagine yourself in percentages and you're just knocking it up percentages and breaking down the shapes. So in here I'm just putting the base shapes of a mid-tone in place surrounding the eye. So now I can start building other shapes on top of that, and which you can see I'm doing here. I take this darker, warmer tone and start to cover the areas where it exists in the photo reference. Keep going back and forth, adjusting each shape until you get happier. And when you get to a place where you feel you are correct on the bigger shapes, zero in again. So where you were 10% before, now you're going to knock it up to 20% in. So you're looking for more smaller details. You can use this with a spray can by just tapping it very slightly against the wall. In fact, if you are to put the cap on the wall and then you can just hit the back of the can, that will give you a very small circle. And as another tip, do not be afraid to use your fingers. This works so much. Because it's a big portrait, you can get away with spraying a small bit on the wall, dabbing your finger in the paint, and then just dabbing the dots to indicate where the highlights sit on the portrait. Now this is where it was so important to put the light and dark tones in place. Now we start moving in towards the mid-range of our colour palette. We just slowly and carefully spray mist to indicate folds, to give the face different dimensions. There on the cheek you can see I just put the darker tone, which then indicates that it's a round shape. I'm just going to continue on now, putting in all the mid-tones so I get more of a fuller portrait. Now when it comes to the nose, you want to establish the dark tones compared next to the lighter tones. Also, I'm starting to move into the more of the pinker range of the colour palette. With a human portrait, there's a lot of reds that exist within the nose, the ears, and also just below the eyes on the cheekbone. So adding this little trick, or adding the pink tones, really will give you much more of a stronger dimension of realism. You can find this example from anywhere. Just go on Pinterest now and look at some photos of portraits, and you'll see very subtly redder tones exist in those places. Moving on to the left eye, you want to very roughly establish the warm colours, the same colours we used for the right eye. Only thing that will make the left eye different to the right is that there is a lot more darker shapes that exist here. This is due to it being hidden behind the bridge of the nose. Once again, we place a light grey for the eye, then a darker grey, and angle it downwards from the top lid. Doing this will give it a very natural three-dimensional look. Now this is why it paid to put on the base tone of the lips first. Now you just want to take your second darkest tone for the lips and slowly start highlighting the curvature of both the bottom and top lip. This is where a lot of back and forth will come in. Once you've hit it with the second darkest, go back over with the darkest, back and forth, and then go over with the second dark once again. By doing this, you will have a multitude of colours indicating the three-dimensional shape, which is the round shape of both lips. Similar to the lips, with the hair I'm using actually the same colour for this part. So here I've blocked in the whole area with the darkest tone. And once again, I need to indicate the shape and the flow of where the hair goes. To do this, I take the second lightest tone and just put rough up and down shapes, almost like a hairbrush going up and down. Once that's in place, I then resort back to the darker tone which I use for the base. I spray over all the secondary colours completely, so it's all covered with a light mist. I'm not looking to cover it boldly. As you can see, I just mist it up so it falls deeper into the portrait, and then I go over it again re-highlighting certain areas with the second darkest again. A little bit of confusion there, but I hope that makes sense. But that is how you give it a layered effect instead of just doing strands of hair, which end up with portraits that look like mum's spaghetti in the hair. But that's not to say that we won't be using the spaghetti technique anywhere. Here for the edges or the outward edges of the portrait, I do like to do a few loose strands just to give it more of a flow, even if it doesn't exist in the portrait per se. Just giving it a few of those loose lines sort of just loosens up the entire portrait. And right guys, so following those steps you should have a result that looks like this. And now I'm going to let you know one of the biggest secrets any graffiti portrait artist has, and that is relying on the transparent colours. Transparent colours are basically see-through. So this is a dark tone and this is your light tone, a black and a white. And what I'm looking to do is go over the whole portrait now, picking up the highlight areas to add depth and contrast. But I'm going to give you a warning. Don't go over the top with these. In my opinion, less is more. Just use this to bring out the eyes, hit things in depth, and yeah, really bring things forward.
Waiting happy.
That is the fundamentals of how I would approach a portrait, start to finish. There's been another one I dropped which has other materials like a PDF and stuff and material lists. If you haven't seen that, go check that out. And if there's anything else that you guys on the Patreon want to see, please let me know in the comment section. I read all the comments and I really appreciate any feedback to help grow the Patreon, and not only the Patreon, but the YouTube as well. And like I said, we're on the road to 100k, so let's get our ass in gear and get there. Thank you as always for all the support. Until next time, keep creating, you stay well, peace.